Okay, hello everybody again. It's me again, Glenn, and I'm introducing our next speaker. We have an incredible lineup here of speakers, and this one is no exception. And he has worked on like Avengers, Age of Ultron, Guardians of the Galaxy, and these guys have done a really great job. He's working for Territory Studios, and he's the head of 3D. Yeah, head of 3D. And they have done an incredible job working with Cinema 4D on these movies. So I encourage you to watch this. Internet, thanks for coming as well. Here is Mr. Yeah, I have to drink something. Here's Mr. Peter Eszenyi.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Hope you're all right. My name is Peter Eszenyi, and I'm the head of 3D for Territory Studio, which is a studio based in London. And just a few quick words about what we do. The thing that we do the most of the time is working on computer user interfaces for feature films, such as the Avengers, Age of Ultron, Zero Dark 30, Guardians of the Galaxy, Prometheus, you might have seen that one. And I'm going to talk about how we approach stuff when we are asked to create something for these films and how we do these things with Cinema 4D. So I tried to talk about 3 films today. This is my 3rd presentation, and I thought I'm going to introduce something new. So the first film I'm going to talk about is called Hitman Agent 47. I don't know if you've seen it. It's out for a couple of weeks now. It's about a genetically modified guy who does good things or bad things. We were asked to do a few screens for that film, and I'm going to show you how we did a little bit that was featured in the title sequence, which we were also asked to do. So the way we work usually is when we are asked to do stuff on these films, is we work usually when the film starts to be created. We sit down with the director, the production designer, they talk about their ideas for what they want to see on these screens, and we try to help them to create these just to make sure that it tells the story. So everything that we do is there to support the narrative. So if someone is doing something on the screen that's important from the story perspective, we are really trying to do everything to make sure that it really tells the story. And we have like just a tiny fraction of time and just a tiny fraction of attention from the viewer. So that's why we feel it's really important to create images that tell the story and fit the aesthetics of the film. So in Agent 47, we were asked to do the title sequence, which was a brilliant opportunity for us to venture into a slightly different area. And one of the shots that I worked on is the very first shot of the film. And the brief initially was that they wanted to show the viewer that a strand of DNA is being created. That was the first brief. So when we got the call to do that, we immediately started to think about how to approach that issue. So let me show you the first thing. It's actually the second one, so bear with me for a second. This is the first test that we did. What you see here is Cinema 4D, R16. We're going to move on to 17 very, very soon. And when we got a brief like that, we immediately start to think about the aesthetics, how it should look like. But when we are doing that, we have to also keep an eye on the production times and problems and issues. And we have to make sure that everything that we do is possible within that time frame that we have. Because, you know, these sort of like limits that we have on time when we work on films like this are quite restrictive. It could be, you know, as tricky as having a day to design a screen or having maybe a day or day and a half to come up with a 3D asset. In this case, it was slightly different because it was a title sequence, so we had a bit more time to do that. But we immediately started to think about how to solve this problem. So DNA, we all know how it looks like. The thing is that in reality, DNA looks quite different, and it's not really as attractive as we see it on a screen. But this is a film. This is not science, and we wanted to create something that immediately connects with the viewer, and everyone would be able to recognize it. Oh yeah, this is DNA. So we did a few tests where we had like animated cylinders and some noise shader on top of them, noise deformer, just to play with the idea of like, all right, this is an interesting way of showing it. We did a couple of versions of these, so not just one, more than one. Different versions of the noise that sort of like drives these kind of bad boys there. And what you see here is a very interesting setup that we tend to use quite often. And it is, you see cylinder, which is animated, just sort of like a scale animation, goes from 0 to 1 on the x-axis, so it sort of like seems to grow out. We have a displacement deformer, or displacer, that's using a noise that creates these undulating little thingies. And then everything is put into an particle skinner that creates these metaball-looking things, which is a slightly more organic. This is a very low poly version of the whole thing, but this is an interesting way to create something that might be perceived as organic. So when we started working on this, that was the first step, and then the second step was a slightly more advanced version. We knew quite early on that we have to keep the narrative in the main focus, and the narrative was talking about DNA is coming towards the camera. We see it really up close, and then it fades away. So quite early on, we established the camera move. We were hoping that's going to satisfy the needs of the production, and then we started to apply all these little tests that I showed you earlier in a more understandable form. So what you see here is based on that little thing that I showed you earlier, but we created some cylinders, twisted them around, and created a rough shape of a DNA. This is absolutely not a highly sophisticated representation of the thing. It really works for us, and it really works for the editorial department to be able to judge whether this shot, which is roughly about, I think it was 120 frames, which is not that long, roughly 3-4 seconds, whether this shot is able to tell the story that they want to tell in that time. So as you see here, it's a very similar setup to the one that I showed you earlier. We have the model, those little animated things that I showed you, and they are in a cloner. Let me show you where they are. There you go. I think. Yeah. They're in a cloner, those little strands that I did earlier, and they are cloned onto cylinders, 2 cylinders that's the sides of the DNA, and everything is loaded into a twist object. And everything that's in the twist object is loaded into an X-particle skinner, which you see here, that creates that sort of like organic look. Brings all the surfaces that are in the cloner and creates something that seems to be like a one-piece version of this separate element. So we started to work on this, started to think about shaders, started to think about how to approach the lighting, started to think about, when we do a shot like this, it's always a mixture of different elements. So we had to think about the background, we had to think about the foreground. This is a very, very sort of like microscopic shot, so very shallow depth of field. We knew quite early on that that's going to be needed, so we thought about ways to create more depth without having to resolve back to like excess blurring of background and foreground objects. And then we got a slightly different version of the brief. And the different version was different because now the DNA must be destroyed. So that was exactly the opposite. But because the way we work and the way we tend to use these softwares, namely Cinema 4D in this case, is I would like to say we are pretty much prepared to come up with, quite easy and quick reactions to changes like that. So we knew that we had something else in the bag. So destroying the DNA, how shall we do it? And quite early on we thought about using, hang on a sec. Ooh, nice. Let me do it this way. So quite early on, we thought about using X particles to be emitted from a surface. And those particles can be tweaked in a very interesting way. And if you sort of like use all sorts of turbulences, noises, crazy stuff, explosive sort of like forces, and then you put everything under the skinner, you again end up with something that looks quite organic. Let me show you this. This is a different version of the whole piece. As you see, the camera, even the camera move changed a bit. So what we have here is we have some base geometry and some particles being emitted from that, and there's a force that sort of like drives these particles apart, and as they driven apart, they're put into another group, and that group is being affected by some turbulence. Just to give you an idea how this looks when it's skinned, let me just do it very quickly. So we have the surface here. Just turn this on. Turn on the skinners. I don't know if you're familiar with X particles, but the skinner is very similar to the metable object. It's some sort of a metable on acid. So what you see here is those particles down there getting quite heavy, so I stop it. Like Uri Geller, stop. Let me show you the video. Because we rendered like lots of variations of this. Yeah, there you are, stubbed. This shows you quite well that we have one skinner setup, which seems to be quite dense, and we have another one down there. But when you render it, it looks like one object. And let me show you how it looks. I think it's this one. No, this was the first one. This is a very similar setup to the one that you saw earlier. So this is these are just particles put into a skinner. And because they are particles, they're quite easily affected by various forces that can be sort of like tweaked to the liking of the, I mean, like, you know, to fit the description of the scene. And that's also a very important thing for us, because I'm pretty sure you know that films are quite prone to changes. So when we do something, it's highly likely that the next day or a couple of days later, someone is going to change it, and usually for the better. So we are really happy to do those changes, and we have to react to that very quickly. So that was a setup that we sort of like started to develop, and it was working quite well. We really loved it. Obviously, these are, as I said, quite early tests, so the resolution are not really high, and the way we tend to work is just do something very quickly, see if it works, and if it works, then we go all out, do the high quality stuff. But then again, changes, as I said. So what happened is we had to immediately think about a third way of doing this, and the third way was to use cloth. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but basically cloth started out to be a sort of like a cloth system. So if you have a character, you want to put some cloth on it and animate it, it really helps with that. But because this is a very flexible application, we are able to abuse it in a way that was never thought about, or at least it's not the intended way to use it. So what we did, we sculpted a DNA strand, and then we treat it as a cloth object. And when it's treated as a cloth object, all sorts of forces can be used to tear it apart. And let me show you how it works. Let's go from frame 60, and let's see. Again, this is a slightly different camera move. It changes every now and then, so we really have to keep an eye on those kind of changes and make sure that they happen in time. As you see, it's starting to happen here. Something really exciting is there, and that looks quite, I wanted to use the word sexy, but it's not exactly sexy, but I like it. So this is something that was really interesting for us, and something that also intrigued the production. And they said, all right, this is the way we want to see the DNA being destroyed, and let's just flesh it out. So that's the method that we used for this shot. And just to make sure that everyone understands the amount of tests that we have to do when we do something like that for 120 frames, sorry. Let me just show you a few examples of the same scene with slightly different settings. And these are all the steps that we had to do when we were testing this method. And we wanted to find the most exciting one and the one that fulfills the brief the most. And it was roughly around this version when we started to say, yeah, this is interesting. You know, those little curls up there, those little pieces flying off, these are really, really interesting for us. So yeah, I mean, I love it. This really looks very interesting for me. And so that's the moment that we use, that's the final version. And when we had the method to create this shot, that's when the other part of the fun started, and that's when we started to shade it. And the way we did it is we used, I'm pretty sure you know that Cinema 4D has quite a few renderers integrated or working very close with. We used V-Ray and Advanced Renderer for this show. And the way we did it is we rendered out lots of passes. We rendered out some subsurface scattering, some ambient occlusion, depth passes, all sorts of noise treatments on top of these layers. So this was the original one that we sort of like, all right, this is the one that we like. It looks quite organic. It's kind of hard to tell what it is. It looks a bit sort of like translucent here and there. It's kind of like nicely lit, which is like, you don't really see that too often inside your body, that it's got a nice lighting rig to it, but we thought that we might be able to get away with that. And then, again, just to illustrate how things are evolving, we had to sort of like come up with an even more interesting treatment. As you see, the main difference between these two is it's got a very sort of like small scale noise on top of the original one, so it's even more organic or exciting. And I think this was the final one that we ended up using. Again, there was a little sort of like thing that we had to do, that the texture needed to be animated towards the center just to sort of like predict that it's going to be destroyed. So it's not really just a piece of DNA coming closer to the camera and just explodes, but the viewer sort of like immediately understands the story that something is happening to this, and that's the force that drives the explosion. So if you're interested in how this ended up, let me show you the final one, which was the final shot. That's the very first shot of the film, obviously with the main grade of the title applied. So this was treated in After Effects, and I have a little breakdown of the whole thing if you want to watch it. I mean, like, what's even, but that was, I think that was the main sort of like C4D render. Obviously, we render everything in layers, so we were able to tweak, like, is it a little bit too dark? So we had to like knock it back a little bit and tweak the colors and tweak the lighting a bit. But to sort of like give you an overview of on what we did for Agent, here's a little video that shows this. So this is a very brief summary of what we did on Agent 47. This is like, creating one of the screens that's used in a film, also using Cinema 4D. And this is DNA. We did some other VFX shots for the title sequence, like, just newspapers and burning documents and all sorts of stuff that's been used for this production. So I think this very clearly demonstrates the idea of Cinema 4D is a very versatile tool, even in the most demanding VFX environments. So that sums it up. That's Agent 47. The next thing I'd like to talk about, and if you have questions, just feel free to ask them. I'm going to have a few minutes at the end of this, or I'm going to be, found somewhere around here. Just a few words before we go into the Avengers. Just a few words about this. This is a very interesting project. We were approached by a guy who had this idea of his to create a film about a robotic dog and some motocross drivers in sort of like California. It was a very special story, and he told us that he wants to create a proof of concept film, a sort of a short film, and he'd like us to be on board with that. And because this was a quite low budget project, we were having a bit more freedom than usual to create things. So what we did for this film, I'm going to be short on this one, but what we did for this film is we created some screens, as we do. This is the thing that most of the film work represents. And we were asked to create some robot vision stuff, which was a very interesting challenge for us because that was about how would this robotic dog see the world. And as a studio that specializes in creating UI, we were absolutely intrigued by that little brief because it was like going all out. How do you, like, if you think about a robotic dog, it doesn't necessarily have to see the world in a way that us humans do. So we had this very interesting concept, and we went through a few iterations and changes. And just let me show you a few things very quickly what we did with Cinema 4D. That was one of the first tests. So this is something that we thought represents how that electronic, mechanical, robotic beast sees the world. And that was a very interesting help that we got in this project. And there was a guy, or there is a guy called Andrew Gant, and he's a guy that sort of like uses the technique that hacks the Kinect, the Microsoft Kinect, to create 3D models. And he used the Kinect, he hooked it up to the camera, and when they did the take, they were also able to take 3D data from the set. So we ended up having the shot, and we ended up with a massive amount of OBJ files that each OBJ file represented one frame of the shot. So we got these OBJ files into Cinema 4D, cleaned them up a bit, and started to play with them. So again, we used X particles to emit particles from. We used Sketch and Tune to create other interesting treatments with it. And of course, we loaded everything into After Effects, and we sort of like tweaked it to death there as well. So these were like the final candidates for the signed off look. As you see, it's got the usual particle setup, and it's got like a very low poly representation, sort of like a cage on top of it. It's got some numbers floating around it. Um, we had a slightly different version, and that's pretty much what ended up being the final, where you also have like topological lines going through that surface. And all that slightly chaotic and slightly glowing thing we thought represents quite well how this animal could be, sort of like how this animal could see the world around it. And this is a film. So if you're watching a film, you have to make sure, or if you're creating a film, you have to make sure that the viewers understand what you do. So we had to tone it back a little bit. So we had to sort of like turn down the abstract parts a little bit. And let me show you very quickly how we ended up on this shot. This is the final shot in the film. So, as always, we created some beautiful UI assets around this, and we had the 3D stuff in there. And this is, when in context of the film, you understand that this is how the animal sees the world. And I think this was a lovely little thing that we were able, really lucky to take part in. Besides this, we had some other stuff to do on this film, and which I'm going to demonstrate how we did it. And I think it was this. So, nice. Just very quickly. There you are. So that's a shot from the film, and this is a guy who sort of like controls this animal, and the brief on this shot was to create some UI elements for the screen, which are there, and to create something like a holographic user interface. And when you think of holographic, you immediately think of 3D, having something that moves in space. So some of these elements, this is usually the way we work. Some of these elements are created in Illustrator, and some of these elements are created in Cinema 4D, and everything is brought together in After Effects. So I'm going to talk about this little thing here because that clearly shows a very interesting Cinema 4D workflow. Before we go into details, let me show you a few versions of the look. So again, we wanted to feature those particles. Again, a slightly different version, and also another version. So I think we ended up with using this. And this quite well sums up how we approach 3D elements for UI interfaces. And the basic approach is to render out as much as we can. So render out different passes, render out the particle pass, render out some wireframes, although I don't like wireframes as they come out from 3D software. Render out Fresnel passes, render out ambient occlusion passes, particles, basically everything that we can get our hands on. Just very quickly, let me show you how this is set up within Cinema 4D. Brilliant. iTunes plays again. So, there's the beast. Some lovely guys in America animated this model, and we converted those animations into an alembic format. And with Alembic, we are able to bring in animations from other software. So I think this was animated in Maya, but via Alembic, it ended up, having the same animation. We ended up having the same animation in Cinema 4D without any issues. So we were just able to create the look. So this is actually animated. And this is one of the passes. that I want to show you. This one uses V-Ray, and this is a subsurface scattering pass. And as far as subsurface scattering goes, this is not the perfect example of how it should look like. But because this is something that's part of a fantasy UI or a science fiction UI, we're really happy to have all these little imperfections there because that creates something more interesting than our perfectly clear render. So that's one of the passes. You can imagine how it goes. Here's another version. There's the same shot, a slightly different frame. We love this shader. This is a V-Ray shader called V-Ray Edge Shader. And what it does, it renders out a wireframe, but the wireframe can be fed into an alpha channel, and it creates a sort of like a skeletal kind of look. So you are able to see the other part of the object. So it's not just the usual flat wireframe, but you can see inside this piece. And again, this in itself is already interesting, but use this with all the other passes, that creates something that's immensely tweakable, which is like, you can tweak all the colors, the sort of like the amount of this in that shot. So really love it, and it renders quite fast. And we had some other passes for this. We had I think it was this one. Nice. So what we have here is again the same animated polygonal object with the animation baked in, and we have an X particles emitter that emits a very organized grid from the volume. So you immediately have something that's very interesting, again, from a UI point of view, because that's a 3D object, but with some sort of very ordered grid type thing going on within. And we love that. So we render this, render like, I don't know, a couple more other passes, and then, as I showed you, this is what we ended up with. That was the final look. So that's everything combined together, and obviously it's animated, and it needed comp. So yeah. So that's mouse. And now the third part of my little presentation, which is going to deal with the Avengers. Have you seen the Avengers? All right. We started to work on the Avengers right after Guardians of the Galaxy, and I might have skipped that part, but I think I mentioned it. The way we work is most of our work is done before the film starts to shoot, just to make sure that everything is on set, so the actors can interact with it, and therefore we have a certain amount of development time that sort of like develops together how the film develops, and this part of the work ends up when the film is wrapped up. So everything is finished on set, and the second part, which is a much more restrictive process, starts when the post process starts. So if there was a green screen for some reason, we're going to get that green screen, and we're going to put all these little things in these screens in there as well. So what we're going to talk about with the Avengers is I'm going to break down this shot. dance break. Nice one. So this was one of the screens for the Avengers. The story behind this screen was that this is an alien arm that they recovered from somewhere, and they just started to analyze it. So this screen needed to tell the story that this is an alien arm, in case you missed the 6 fingers. I missed it first time, so I thought, yeah, that's an interesting one. And it's got some sort of an armor going around it, and all these surface details are there to tell you the story that this is an alien arm. And all these details on the screen were designed by my colleagues. And this is an interesting thing about Territory Studio, that everyone does a little bit of everything. But some of my colleagues are really extraordinary graphical designers, and they are like leading the design of the 2D assets. And some of my colleagues, including I think he's here, Nick. Nick is there. He's just touching his phone, not looking at us. Nick. Anyway, he's busy. So Nick is designing these assets as well as some screen elements, and everything is brought together at the end. So let me show you how we did this. Before I start, let me show you a few things that we started to explore when our work on the Avengers started. The brief was quite early on to come up with 3D assets that can be used as hero elements in a UI screen. They are 3-dimensional and some sort of, represent something that's organic, or something that's some organic stuff being manipulated. And we started to explore like interesting things, like this is an X-particle setup frozen in time. I don't know what this is, but this already looks exciting. So we started to explore these sort of methods of how to create a human body, a scan of a human body that's a little bit different from the usual wireframes and stuff like that. So we started to explore the methods of using volumes to represent like 3D objects instead of just having like quads. This is a quick animation of something that we did for one of the screens. This is an X-particle setup frozen in time. Again, I don't know what this is, but if you put it in the middle of one of those lovely screens, it already sort of like tells you something interesting is going on. Again, another setup, and I show you this because this is one of the stuff that ended up being in the actual final set of screens that we did for this. As you see, this is pretty much how we approach, a UI project. We have 3D assets, 3D hero elements. That's the bad boy I showed you earlier. That was strong enough to stay there. We have this, which looks like a nice digital lasagna. We have arms. We have like skulls and stuff like that. And my colleagues and sometimes me, we design all these elements, and we create a huge library of assets that can be quite quickly repurposed. So we have the hero element, and we have some elements from the library, and just move it around that, and you immediately have a variation in the screens. So these are not the screens. I mean, although they are using the same elements, these are very different screens. And again, you are able to repurpose them quite quickly. So we are able to deal with the demands. And just to give you an example, to come up with something, to animate something like this, after we have the initial design stuff, is usually done in a day. So we don't have too much time to do that. And we have to be absolutely sure that we are able to deliver, because films can't wait. So let me show you how this was done. So all we have here is the actual 3D asset. Switch to quick shading. This is a 3D asset that we got from one of the other VFX vendors, and it was part of a bigger model, but because this screen was dealing with the arm being analyzed, we just chopped it off. Obviously, if you want to do something like this, you can use any model that you want. You can create it within Cinema 4D or bring in other models from other software. But this is pretty much what we started with. So this setup here deals with one of the things that I like to do most of the time. Is I think that's one of the things that I try to think about a lot. Is when you see something like this on the screen, it immediately tells you that this is computer generated, because you see all those quads or sometimes triangles nicely flowing around the surface, and your brain immediately says, all right, this is like another CG creation, really nice, all right, let's move further on. So one of the things that I like to do is trying to eliminate those quads, trying to get rid of them, trying to come up with something that's slightly more interesting. If you think about even like, having like hexagons instead of those squads, that's immediately more interesting than having something like that. Although there are very different methods to create those sort of tessellations, but one of the easiest things to do in Cinema 4D is to create those with a texture. And the way it works is you have, let's use a noise shader in this example. Choose something that's interesting, like electric. Make it quite big in the beginning. Tweak the contrast a bit, and as you see, it's mapped onto the. Let me turn off the armor. So it's mapped onto the surface. Turn off the lines. It's mapped onto the surface, and we want X particles to generate particles coming from that thing. So what I did, I fed the texture into the relevant slot, and I told it to use the luminance channel because that's where the noise shader is used. And if it did everything well, it starts to emit particles. So you immediately have something that's interesting. And from this point on, it's really up to you what you do with it. If you want to change the scale of the texture, you are really free to do that. Immediately looks different. I tried to do it live actually, just to see how it works. Maybe, just change the contrast a bit. I don't think it plays back live. So, and you can go sort of like all out. You can design your own texture and map it onto this object, or fed a video into it, or I don't know. Try to find some image on this hard drive. That's the tricky bit. That's that's where the bad things happen. Try to search for images. Images, nice. Let's feed the robot dog into that. So we have this, put it into a filter, just we don't confuse it, so it's black and white. It's mapped onto the arm. It doesn't matter how it's mapped onto it. I mean, like, it should be like UV, but because X Particles uses that for emission, and in theory, we should be able to see something being emitted. So yeah, that's that material. It's not super exciting, but it uses a picture to create all these particles. So that's one part of the thing. And again, as I said, we used all the other tricks in the book to create more passes. This is the very basic points pass. Again, what I like about this is you can see through the whole thing. So your brain immediately sees this as a 3D object and something that's, do you know that trick? Which way it turns? I have no idea now, but yeah, actually, it's quite interesting. So again, what to take home from this is just, explore. This is a piece of software that lets you do that, and this is like one of the easiest ways of creating incredibly nice projects and designs. So I think that's pretty much how we ended up doing the Avengers. Let me show you a few more things that we did on that one. This is the screen that I showed you. And this is another screen that uses a slightly different technique. Again, particles, but there's another emitter that goes around it, so the particles are bounced back from the surface. And when you have that in conjunction with all those lovely UI details, you create something that really looks interesting. So again, slightly different version of it. Sketch and tune being used here. I mean, generally, as I said, just try out everything, throw everything at it, and something sticks, and something is going to look nice. And it's much easier for you to judge your creations based on what you created later on than trying to commit to something quite early on. You see, that's what I was talking about. Slightly different variation of the same thing, slightly different color. Again, something that was used originally for something else. A 3D volumetric point cloud being used as a 3D asset. These were background screens, so these were not really specifically telling a story point, but they were there to create interest and look nice. Again, same kind of stuff. And just to sum it up, here's a little reel that shows you the scope of work that we did on Avengers: Age of Ultron. So that was it. Thank you very much. If you're interested to see a little bit more how we did these kind of things from a slightly different perspective, my colleague and friend Nick Hill is going to talk about some of the stuff at 3:30 at the Adobe booth. And if you have any questions or any interesting or anything that you are interested in with regards to these kind of projects, just feel free to ask. we can do it there, we can do it here, whatever you want. Any questions? Anyone? Go ahead. All right.
I'm just starting with all of this.
Yeah.
I'm at school and it's my last year. We haven't learned anything about cinema theory,
Hmm.
but I'm scared that my next school
Don't worry
will
about it.
ask me if I'm able to do this. And I really want to do this, but I don't know how to start.
Okay. So the question was that what's your name? Sorry. Sorry.
Joanne.
Joanne. Joanne wants to use Cinema 4D, and they don't really get taught in the school how to work with Cinema 4D. I think my answer is, honestly, this is the easiest to learn piece of 3D software out there. And there are like, there's a couple of online forums where you can get always good advice from, and there are an incredible amount of tutorial videos out there, some paid ones, but some free ones as well. And the free ones are super exciting, and they take you through the whole process of like how to start using that. And I'm pretty sure that if you search for stuff like this, something that's even more exciting, what I did, is up there. So yeah, just do a search for C4D tutorials, and you're going to find everything out there. But if you have any questions, just drop me a line, and I'll try to help. Right? Any other questions?
Do you have any more tips for beginners? And how long are you in this industry?
Okay, so the question is whether I have any tips for beginners. And this is always a tricky one, without going into like a 2-hour talk about how to do these kind of things. All I want to say is just do your own stuff. Just the most important thing is to create stuff that you feel is good. It doesn't matter what you use. If it's just pen and pencil, if it's just some ideas written down, that's the most important thing. And when you have that, and when you have all those crazy ideas of yours, I'm pretty sure you're going to find a way to express them, whether it's via a piece of software or if it's like, you tell those to someone who helps you to create these kind of things. But I think that the most important thing is to make sure that it comes from the heart, which sounds a bit cheesy, but this is how it is. So, and I think, if you're really into this and if you're willing to learn everything that you can do, I think in a couple of years, you're going to be on top of your game. Just keep on doing it. And yeah, I hope it helps. Anyone else? Go ahead. Hiya. Very interesting question. We are at the Maxon booth. We tend to use V-Ray and AR the most. So the built-in renderer for Cinema 4D. If you use it for sketch and tune and all sorts of stuff. But V-Ray seems to be the one that we use the most. But I've seen. Yeah, but that works with the AR engine. So, and it was just asking about render engines, not just plugins in general. Yeah. Well, V-Ray seems to be the preferred option. Although I saw Arnold being demonstrated here, and that's or Octane. But again, that comes down to the question whether you are a PC or a Mac, and how to transform a studio from one to other. I think it's mind-blowing that the options are out there, and you can do whatever you want to do. And if you learn Arnold in one platform, you can use it, with any other software, or V-Ray for that matter. So everything that you can find, just do your stuff. And yes, Xparticles. Xparticles is one of the most important plugins that we use. We use it quite a lot. Well, it's a bit different because the cloner is more like an object-based kind of thing, and the Xparticles you can use like millions of particles that you can't really do with the cloner in its form, and it's very easy to use, very easy to set up, very easy to create interesting stuff with, especially if you're really having a fraction of time to do these kind of things. So that's the main reason. All right, anyone else? Anything else? No problem. Thank you very much, and see you soon. Cheers, guys.